Hamilton wrote, the other 51.
So you're actually my second repeat guest here in doing this podcast. We had talked before after the Bills ownership story, talking with Tim Graham today of the Buffalo News, and I believe your ex-husband is how you refer to him on Twitter?
Yeah, Tyler Dunn.
Yeah, he spoke with me earlier, and then he did an earlier episode of the podcast. So I feel good. It's like a Done with Graham reunion we're having here a little bit.
That's right. Anytime that he and I can be in the same place in spirit, it's a good time. It's good for the kid.
I got to tell you, I do miss that podcast. That was one of my favorites. And
thanks, Brian.
And so we'll get this out of the way since you do a lot of Bills coverage before we get to talking about writing. And being a Bills fan, I got no hope, right?
It doesn't look good.
No.
I don't think it's a pretty shaky start. I mean, the numbers bear it out. 12% chance of making the playoffs when you start off 0-2. And those are all teams. This is not just teams that happen to be also in the New England Patriots division, teams that start out 0-2 in the conference, teams that already are in the hole, are 2 games behind first place. So, yeah, it seems to be pretty stacked against them. Oh, and by the way, there's turmoil and chaos. So some 0-2 teams start off. For instance, last year's New Orleans Saints. No, I'm already misspoken. Last year's Seattle Seahawks start off 0-2 and happen to be the defending champs. So, yeah, this not all 0-2 teams that factor into that 12% success rate had just fired their offensive coordinator after 2 games.
And after one of their better offensive games that they've had in the past few years too, where they finally kind of, their offense is sketchy, but at least they were able to do some things, and it just seems like a very weird like a bad, weird team situation going on there. It just doesn't. It feels like that, like not just an 0-2 and they're struggling, but they're coming around, but there's some life, or like this is just a calamity right now. I mean, it's an utter calamity.
The way that the Bills played in week 2 against the Jets, granted, they didn't have sustained drives until the end of the game, but chunk yards are an actual thing in the NFL.
Right.
And the Bills were getting chunk yardage like crazy. That was the big thing that Doug Marrone would talk about on a weekly basis, is how the defense was giving up chunk plays and they were unable to get their own chunk plays. That, coaches actually plan to get that type of stuff. It's part of the game. And so, yeah, you can argue that the Bills didn't have sustained drives and had trouble converting third downs, but they still had 2 of the longest pass plays in recent history, and they just happened to be in the same game.
Yeah. So when you're as a reporter, and I know you don't do a lot of the day-to-day coverage with the team anymore that you used to, but I mean, when you get a team like this year's Bills, and that's just a mess, it appears to be just an absolute mess. I mean, is that a gold mine for writers and reporters in a way?
Well, yeah, I suppose so, but so is a winning team. And I think that the most interest you're going to get from your readers are when a team is really good or really bad. And an 8-8 football team, I think a lot of times people will sleepwalk through the season in terms of coverage, or just the consumer who wants to follow the team. It just gets kind of dull, and maybe you just have the people following along for fantasy football purposes. But when there's a firing of an offensive coordinator and the head coach appears to be on the hot seat, people are reading because they want to know what's going to happen next, when change is going to finally come. They're looking for clues, whether it be from the coach or the general manager or the owner. And by the same token, when the team's winning, of course, everybody loves to find out exactly every little detail about the team. And 2 examples that I could come up with are when I covered the Buffalo Sabres. Earlier on, when I covered the Sabres, the team was bankrupt. Their owner was arrested on federal charges, Philadelphia communication scandal, and the team was for sale, and they had one owner who turned out to not have the money, and Bamister, and then Tom Golisano comes along, and so I covered all that team that was just pitiful on the ice and off the ice, an embarrassment, really, off the ice anyway, to a team that was maybe one of the most beloved sports teams in Buffalo history, the team that went to back-to-back Eastern Conference Finals with Chris Drury and Danny Briere and Ryan Miller winning the Vezina, and it was just so much fun. And the readership, I think the interest was there, and it's just for different reasons. But a team that just misses the playoffs, for instance, nobody seems to get all that worked up about it. And then plus it doesn't carry over into the offseason either, because you don't get a good draft pick. Right. You don't have the playoff buzz that the Sabres had going into their summers after those back-to-back conference final appearances. You didn't have, but the one year they were so bad, you had a high draft pick that turned into Thomas Vanek. So you just, as a writer, I think it's, you just want to avoid mediocrity.
You've moved off of the beat, obviously, in the last few years. Now you do more features, takeouts. I guess long form is the trendy term for it. Just out of curiosity, how many stories are you generally working on at one time? Are you a one-at-a-time person, or do you usually have a couple in different stages?
I prefer to be a one-at-a-time guy. I'm generally the type of person who will dive into a story and I can confuse myself, or I get distracted, where I find myself overworking one story and ignoring another one. But there was a point, I'll say earlier this year, I want to say in the spring, I was working on 6 stories at the same time, and they were in various stages. And right before the season began for our NFL preview edition, I was working on 3 stories at the same time: a Sammy Watkins, a Khalil Mack, and a Bjorn Nitmo story. And right now I'm currently working on 2 at the same time. But yeah, I prefer to be working, taking them one at a time. Concentrate on one, move it off my plate, take the other one on, or the next one on.
I know it varies dependent on the story and the reporting, but in general, how long are you spending on? How long does it go from a story like I want to write about Khalil Mack to completion? Just as an example, not necessarily that story, but is it a long process? Do you turn around pretty quickly?
Yeah, I would say it's a longer, in general, a longer process. But now that we're here in the season, I want to try to get into a rhythm where it's within a week. For instance, I'm working on a story on Larry Fitzgerald, and I began working on it as soon as that Thursday night game against the Jets was over. And because it was a Thursday night game, I had a little extra time to work on this story that will run in Sunday's paper, because the Bills play Arizona on Sunday, and it's only the second appearance in Orchard Park for Larry Fitzgerald, believe it or not. The guy's been around forever, but the previous 2 times the Bills and Cardinals played each other, the game was in Arizona. So he hasn't played here since his rookie year. He's a great player. He's a future Hall of Famer, and sometimes it's good to write a feature on somebody who's in the league and prominent. He doesn't have to play for the Buffalo Bills. So yeah, I will have worked on that story for probably 9 or 10 days by the time it runs. But generally, when the Bills are playing on Sunday and the game's followed up by their next game the following Sunday, I'll probably work on it 4 days, probably.
And he seems just like a really interesting guy too, Larry Fitzgerald.
He is, and he's considered one of the great guys, and not just a great player, but someone who, by all accounts, does things the right way, treats people well, and the story will be loaded with anecdotes of that, how he takes care of all of the people who consider themselves nobodies. Rich, oh shoot, now I'm drawing blanks on the name. The guy's such a nobody. He's prominently featured in my story, and I'm drawing a blank. Rich Bartel. Okay. Now, you'll need to look this guy up online, not you personally, but anybody listening, because you probably don't remember Rich Bartel, but he played in the NFL for 6 years. He knew exactly one touchdown pass because he was such a deep backup as a journeyman, and he threw exactly one touchdown pass, and it was to Larry Fitzgerald, and it was in the tail end of a blowout loss to San Francisco. The score was 23-0. This touchdown with 6 minutes to go in the game or whatever makes the score 23-7, and Larry Fitzgerald catches the ball, immediately sprints back downfield, and everybody watching is like, why is Larry Fitzgerald so pumped up in a game that's 23-7? And what he wanted to do was give the ball to Rich Bartel because he was attuned to those types of things.
Nice.
And then that Christmas, he gave Rich Bartel a framed photo of Larry giving him the ball on the field. One of the team photographers took a picture. So Rich Bartel, that was his. Turns out that was his lone moment in the NFL, and Larry Fitzgerald made sure that he was going to have it memorialized with the ball, with the photo, framed, and the whole thing. And then another, I think it was the same season even, Beanie Wells, towards the end of a game, is 1 yard shy of the Cardinals' rushing record. And it was kneel down time. It was victory formation time for the Cardinals. So they actually kneel the ball down, and Larry Fitzgerald runs up and down the sideline to tell the coach, Beanie needs 1 more yard for the record. He needs 1 more yard for the record. And everybody's like, how do you even know this? And it's because he's, it's not a receiver's record, but he loves the Cardinals, and he knew all the records. And so the coaches put Beanie Wells back in the game, and he rips off a 10-yard run to make sure that he has the record. And it's just those types of things. And, his humanitarian efforts, the missions that he goes on to South America, to Africa, to give kids hearing aids, to dig wells, giving computers to schools. I mean, the guy just, by all accounts, seems like the real deal. And in the age of Tiger Woods and all kinds of other people that you thought you knew who they were, I'm always hesitant to say he is the real deal, but he's been doing it for a long time. Nobody has a bad word to say about the guy, so he sure does seem like the real deal.
And so how do you go about reporting and writing a story on somebody like Larry Fitzgerald, who, even though he hasn't played in Buffalo a lot, so maybe Buffalo fans and news readers aren't as familiar with him? I mean, he's not like this random dude people have never heard of. Like you said, he's been around forever, going to Hall of Fame. He's a well-known person. So how do you go about trying to tell a story about somebody who's so well-known without repeating all the same stuff that people might know?
Yeah, well, that's the trick. And I have no interest in writing a story that's been written before. And I think in the days before the internet, you could get away with that as a reporter a lot more and say, well, the Buffalo people who subscribe to the Buffalo News maybe haven't read a Larry Fitzgerald story before, but you can't get away with that in 2016, and you probably haven't been able to get away with that for way more than a decade. So I have all of this material out there, and I don't want to duplicate it. I want this story to be read by somebody who's a Cardinals fan and learn something about Larry Fitzgerald. So with me, it always starts with deep research, and I just look for quirky things. And Rich Bartel stood out to me. And in the Cardinals stat packet that they put out, because Larry Fitzgerald is such a prominent player and he just hit 100 career touchdowns, they have a breakdown of all the quarterbacks who've thrown Larry Fitzgerald a touchdown pass. And I went through, and okay, there's Carson Palmer, and there's Kurt Warner, and there's John Skelton and Josh McCown. And I'm like, okay, these people probably, their quotes about Larry Fitzgerald are all, oh wait, who's this guy? Mm-hmm. Who in the hell is Rich Bartel? And so that's when I look at Rich Bartel's stats, and I see that he not only threw one touchdown pass to Larry Fitzgerald, it's the only touchdown pass he threw in his career, and the guy's a former baseball player in the Reds organization, and I thought, and he's now a coach at the IMG Academy in Florida, and I thought to myself, now here's a guy with a perspective that probably doesn't get interviewed too often about Larry Fitzgerald, that's going to be able to tell me something. And as it turns out, they've remained close friends to this day, and he tells me the great anecdote about the touchdown pass, and he remembers it like it was yesterday, of course. And so those are the things I look for. Those are the types of things that really flesh out the story and make it my story, that I can, put it up against somebody else's story about Larry Fitzgerald and say, okay, well, you can read mine too and still learn something new from it.
I love that idea that of not writing a story that's been written before, and it's something when I teach my especially my sports writing class, I try to impart on make my students really learn. I know you've taught, I think, sports writing in the past, is it?
Yeah, I've taught a handful of different classes, but yeah, right now that's what I'm teaching at Canisius College.
Okay, and I try to tell my students that a lot. That if you've ever read a story like this before, don't do it. Or if you've ever heard this quote before, don't use it. And they're students, they're learning, so they have some leeway on it. But I always want to tell them, look for the piece of the story that stands out. The kid coming back from an injury. When you're 19, that's a great story that you've never told before. But those of us who've done this for a while know that, and what makes this kind of unique. And so, I guess it is. You probably agree with this. The reporting and that research that can kind of help you find that out. What's there? What's not been told before? What's the story there that's missing?
That's exactly right. And I think a critical part to, okay, so how do you find out what's not out there?
Mm-hmm.
And you need to obviously hone those instincts. There's some instinct involved, but there's also a common sense approach too. Obviously you start off with the big stories. For instance, there was, Larry Fitzgerald as written by the New York Times or Sports Illustrated. Those bigger features like that,
mm-hmm.
and I read those, and it gets to a point where, all right, then I'm looking at some stats, and that's where a name like Rich Bartel pops up, and it's like, well, I haven't seen Rich Bartel's name anywhere in any of these stories that I've been reading. So when I do come across something that's unusual, it sounds a bell in my head, and that's not to say you don't interview Kurt Warner. In fact, I did for this story. Some guys, you just it makes sense,
mm-hmm.
and Kurt Warner is very accessible, and able to get him through the NFL Network public relations department. They set me up with Kurt Warner, so his voice will be in the story. He's a prominent voice, and so there's some gravitas to a Kurt Warner quote, but I think that the reader is going to notice the Rich Bartel quotes standing out a lot more than the Kurt Warner quotes because it comes from a different place, and a discerning reader probably is going to pick up on that.
Yeah, I use this all the time in my classes too, and the Rich Bartel story. This is the most Rich Bartel's name has ever been uttered in the history of podcasting, I think.
I would imagine so, except he was a high school coach in Texas.
Okay.
So that's a different world,
Oh yes, I know. But
let's say out in the other 49 states.
Yes.
Then I think you're 100% accurate.
Yes. So and the Rich Bartel story kind of passes it, and I tell my students it's called the "Oh cool" test. It's like if you're doing something in your reporting and you're interviewing, and something that makes you stop and go, "Oh cool," or "Holy shit," or something like that. That's your story right there. And I feel like a lot of times it's easy to kind of miss that because people feel like there's a story that they're supposed to write about a Larry Fitzgerald or about something like that. And I always, I love those moments where you can kind of sense in reading it, you can kind of sense the writer thought this was really cool, and that comes across. And I just, I think that's really important, especially when you're writing about somebody who's been written about a lot.
Yeah, and I think there's a trap too, and I'm fortunate that I have editors that don't try to force this, and I have had them in the past, but the localize it.
Yes.
What's the local? What's the hook? Why do people in Buffalo care about Bjorn Nitmo?
Mm-hmm.
Why do people in Buffalo care about Larry Fitzgerald? Well, screw that. A good story is a good story, and my bosses, I had to, especially when I came back from ESPN and I was writing these types of stories. I would occasionally have to, say, all right, we don't need to force into the third paragraph a Bills reference,
right,
or anything. If it comes up organically, it might come up in paragraph, 63 of 75.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't need to mention, within the first 5 inches of a story that Bjorn Nitmo once tried out for the Bills and played for the Buffalo Destroyers of the Arena League. We'll get to that when the appropriate time. So that just happened to be a local angle. But there are stories I've written that had zero local angle that was just an interesting story. And so, yeah, I think that you can, if you're looking for a hook, like you say, that oh cool factor or the holy shit factor. There are sometimes I think it gets forced.
Mm-hmm.
If it doesn't make you feel, if it doesn't feel special, then don't go out of your way to wedge it into your story.
Right. So I did want to talk about the Bjorn Nitmo story because you got a lot of well-deserved kudos. I saw about that story, and it was a fabulous, fabulous read. I'll include it in the show notes for this episode.
Thank you, Brian.
Just for anybody who hasn't read it yet, and if you haven't, and you're listening to this, shame on you. But can you just kind of give us a little bit of almost a Cliff Notes version of Bjorn Nitmo, who he is, and why we have this big story that you wrote about him?
A Cliff Notes version. Well, there's a reason it was 6,000 words. I don't know, but Bjorn Nitmo was a kicker for the New York Giants. Let's do a very, from 30,000 feet. Let's take a look at Bjorn Nitmo before we get too micro. He was a kicker for the New York Giants in 1989. He played all of 6 games in the NFL, but squeezed a lot out of those 6 games because he had a name that David Letterman thought was hilarious to say, and it was just he would talk about his favorite NFL player, Bjorn Nitmo, to Paul Schaefer during the show, and the audience would roar, and they would just kind of riff on it, and eventually they get Bjorn Nitmo on the show. Here he is, a rookie from Sweden, a left-footed kicker, which is also just a little different, and a guy who learned how to kick a football as an exchange student his senior year of high school in Alabama. And 4 years later is sitting on David Letterman's couch, talking to millions of people around the country and kicking for a New York Giants team that was coached by Bill Parcells. Lawrence Taylor's on that team, Phil Simms. I mean, that was a team that was in its little Super Bowl run back there with Parcells and those guys. And they were headed to the playoffs. He was filling in for Raul Alegre, who was hurt. And he just became a bit of a thing for a little bit. And he also had a pretty sad existence, though. I mean, he was trying to chase NFL glory after those 6 games, could never catch on anywhere. He played in the CFL, the Arena League, the World League. He tried out for all kinds of different teams and just couldn't latch on, and came close a couple of times. And on his last try with the NFL with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the mid-'90s, he, during a preseason game, suffered a really bad concussion that took away part of his memory. And as time went on, he grew, he became more and more difficult to just do things like get in his car and drive to work without getting lost. And so it's a story about a pop culture phenomenon. It's a story about concussions. It's a story about a family and his wife and 4 children who were left behind because he just stopped coming home one day and now lives on a Native American reservation in Arizona, they think. And he occasionally will show up out of nowhere to give his kids a birthday gift or slide a Valentine's Day card under his wife's windshield wiper at work, ex-wife, I should say, now. And this is a family that's just confused and heartbroken, and they love him, but they hate him, and they hate what the NFL's done to him. It's just there's a lot of nuance in there, and that's why it took 6,000 words to tell the story. And also a bit of a departure for the Buffalo News is it ran in full online, and it ran an abbreviated version in the newspaper.
Oh wow!
That was maybe 3,000 words, so it's about half the size in the print edition than it was online.
It's in a lot of ways just a gut-wrenching story to read, especially the parts about his family, about his kids and his wife. And one part I kind of wanted to talk about specifically. I love my favorite part of the story. I hate to say that because it's such an emotional part of it. But you describe the play when he was hurt with Tampa Bay, and like you walked through the play, and it was a kickoff return, and he got a concussion on it, and you were watching it with his wife. Am I remembering this correctly? It's been a few weeks since I've read the story.
No, that's right. She had never seen the play because it was a season game. They they were living in South Florida. He was kicking for the Buccaneers, so you don't get those games. Those are on local television in the Tampa Bay market. And this is mid-90s. This is before NFL Network. And so unless somebody was recording that game, you don't get to see the play. And so she never saw it. And I was able to obtain that part of the game. And I asked her numerous times because, I knew that it was something that could be difficult. I said, I have the play. If you'd like to see it, I'll show it to you. She said yes. She wanted to see it. And it was gut-wrenching. And there was some symbolism there that she brought up herself in both at that time and then in an email a couple of days later, because it was keeping her awake at night, was that it was almost like watching him die in a way. Because, as you see, it's an opening kickoff for a game, and you have the traditional shot of the kicker with his hand above his head waiting for the official to whistle the ball live. And then you watch him kick off. Opening kickoff, you see that shot in every game, every Sunday afternoon.
Right.
And there he was with his hand above his head and chomping on his gum, and he kicks the ball into play. And then, of course, the camera zooms out, and you take a look at the return man. So that was her last time seeing him alive in her mind. That was the guy she married for the last time. And then on that play, he gets the concussion. And, as she said later on in the story, it's like mourning his death. It was like watching, and then she was left with, and her family was left with, the carcass that was left.
What for me made that part of the story so effective was the way you wrote it, the way you described the play. I mean, as you just were now, it was very visual. Like I didn't need to watch a video clip to kind of see it in my head, and the way you kind of interspersed both the play with her reaction on that. So when you were writing that section, I mean, what were you trying to do there, kind of stylistically with that section? Because what it did for me, and if this was your intent, it really kind of slowed the story down and in a really effective way, and kind of took it so slow and so descriptive that it was very visual, what I could see as a reader. Is that what you were going for? Go ahead.
Well, thank you for saying that. I don't know that there was any kind of tactic or strategy that I had when I approached that section of the story, other than I didn't want to just tell the reader what happened on the play, even though that's what I was doing. It's also describing, I didn't want the reader to be watching the game. I wanted the reader to be sitting there at that dining room table, watching it with her. And this wasn't just me explaining what happened on the field. It was explaining what this woman was seeing for the first time, because she didn't know what happened on this play either. So she was just as clueless as the reader was about what happened to Bjorn Nitmo. At the moment she's watching it, she didn't know either. She just knew that he suffered a concussion. And so I was able to intersperse that, just her reaction. And then also the other kicker who was paying attention was Michael Husted. And thankfully for me, he remembered the play that matched the video 100%. And so he's giving me his recollection of watching this play from the sideline, and then the interaction that he had with Bjorn Nitmo on the sideline after the injury. So I was able to kind of put everything together and to put the reader in the moment, both at the dining room table and then within the Georgia Dome. And that was just kind of what I was after. I'm glad to hear I pulled it off.
Yeah. When you wrote this story, and I know you had been kind of reporting on it for a long time because you did a little explainer piece about it. When you have or any kind of big story like this, do you tend to write like in a big chunk draft and then edit it? Do you kind of have to start at the lead, like actual writing the story? How does your process usually go?
Well, this is not the perfect process, but this is how you asked me the question, how does it usually go? Not the way I want to, but this is how it usually goes. I have, in fact, my Larry Fitzgerald story is due, or at least I have a self-imposed deadline of tomorrow around lunchtime. And so what's going to happen is I'm going to finish transcribing all my tape after the kids go to bed and probably after my wife goes to bed. So at about 11 p.m. tonight, or 12 tonight, I'm going to sit down at my laptop and write the first words of this story. that I've could have been writing for the past 4 or 5 days. I'm going to transcribe tape, and then at about 1 in the morning, I'm going to actually write the first words, and I'm going to stay awake until I file it. And so that's not the best way to do it, because I think it really handcuffs me in terms of editing. But the Nitmo story, I'm going to be honest, I wrote it so long ago, and I was working on other stories at the same time. I'll need to actually pause for a second and see if I can recall.
Sure.
That was a story that took me over I did that process that I just explained, but over 3 nights, I think it was.
Okay.
That story did not have a deadline because it had we weren't sure what date was going to run, but I was about to go on vacation. So that was my deadline. And I think this is how I write these longer form stories. I will sit down, and this is where the research that we talked about earlier comes in handy. If you do your research deep enough, you will come up with multiple lead ideas. You won't just have the obvious, okay, this is the lead I got to go with. When you spend this much time on a story and you sift through all this information, and as I do, conduct as many interviews, you're going to have an anecdote here. You're going to have a statistical anomaly here. You're going to have an aha moment there, and you're going to have all these different leads you can come up with. I put them down on a notepad and I rank them, and then I put in subheads. And so then I have essentially 4 or 5 mini stories within the story that that allow me to write it in more digestible forms, and I don't have to worry about the previous paragraph flowing perfectly into the next one. And when you have 1,000, 3,000 words, or however many words I'm writing, to be able to do that just from a psychological standpoint allows me to actually sit down and say, okay, I can actually write the story, and I'm not going to give my 2 weeks notice by the end of it. So it's just more of it's a psychological trick to saying, okay, you're not writing one story that's going to take you forever to do. You're actually writing 4 or 5, stories that I would write when I was covering the Sabres, that I would turn in for the paper on a daily basis, or the type of thing, or the blogs that I used to write for ESPN. So just crank out this little guy, and then we're going to stack them all together, and then we're going to have one big story at the end. So that's the way I like to do it, and sometimes I'll jump around. With the Nitmo story, the lead came to me fairly naturally and early, and then I jumped around a little bit. But generally what happens is I'll do that, I'll outline the story, and then I'll stare at a blank screen for a half hour trying to figure out how to get started, because I need to mentally flow from the beginning to the end in general. But sometimes I can bounce around a little bit, but there's still, even though I've gone on with these 4 or 5 mini stories, to write the third one, the third part first, because I can come up with excuses. Well, is this going to be this guy's first reference? Is this going to be the first time I introduce this name? How much do I have to explain who this guy is in the third part, because I might actually get to him in the second part? So it's just, I feel like it could potentially be wasting my time if I don't go in order.
Right. So one other story I wanted to talk about really quick, just because it amused me, and it has a bigger point too, was your feature on Khalil Mack that you wrote. I think it came out at the same time with close around to the time of the Nitmo story. And what I loved about that was you turned the fact that he blew you off into like a central part of the story and didn't want to talk to you into kind of a central part of the story. And I'm just wondering in general, because I know I've seen you done this, and Tyler and I talked about this too, is when do you and how do you decide that you're going to put yourself into the story like that?
Well, that was, and this played a part in that decision, is that ran in the NFL Sunday, or the NFL Preview Edition. It actually ran on the same day as the Nitmo story and a Sammy Watkins feature that I did.
Okay.
And so I know that it's going into a section of just NFL content. And I thought that it was the first person was the best way to handle it in kind of a creative way, or not writing it as though it's not necessarily news, that Khalil Mack blew me off, and I didn't want to make it news. And I also I also cringe a little bit when I see the phrase, Sammy Watkins or Khalil Mack. Khalil Mack. Khalil Mack told a reporter, or everybody knows you're the reporter.
Right.
Your name's on it. So it's just like, go ahead, and I'm just going to say it's me. But I didn't want it to be newsworthy that Khalil Mack blew me off. But I thought it was significant in that, is this the beginning of this guy changing? Is this guy going big time on us? And it's something that people who I interviewed within the story wondered too. And so it was there, but I also didn't want it to be, I wanted all of the material I had about Khalil Mack was how great he is.
Right.
So I didn't want it to be a negative, I didn't want it to be, I wasn't out to bash Khalil Mack. I just thought it was significant, but I didn't want it to be the heart of the story. And the heart of the story was, this guy's pretty damn good.
Right.
In fact, he may be the best defensive player in the NFL, especially with J.J. Watt coming off the surgery. And that's what I wanted the story to be about. But still, it's tough to write a story like that and not get and have the guy not talk to you. How can I'm supposed to be able to ask him, about taking this leap, about helping the Raiders get into the playoffs, about just being great and overlooked almost his whole life, and which is why he ends up at the University of Buffalo. All of that stuff. And then, but to not be able to talk to him, really threw a wrench in things, and I needed to account for that somehow.
What's the best thing you've read lately?
Oh boy, I'm not a good reader. The best thing I've read lately is probably 3 or 4 different stories on Larry Fitzgerald from the past decade.
Okay. Because
that's what I'm into right now. What have I read? I just read something. Listeners may, so that way they don't think I'm just a layabout. If you're, I've had a back issue, and I just read something this morning in bed while I was trying to get on my feet earlier today, and I am drawing a blank.
All right.
How dare you put me on a spot with such a trick question?
It gotcha journalism is what we do best on here.
Asking a journalist what he's read that's really good lately, and that's a dirty trick.
It's a jerk move. What can I say? All right. Well, I'll get you out of here on this. And the last time we talked about this subject too. So I'll get your updated take on it. Best kids movie you've seen lately?
Oh, I haven't seen many. Well, I've seen a lot of movies. I'm not waffling on this. I'm actually coming out and saying I haven't seen a good one lately. I've seen a lot of them. Secret Life of Pets was disappointing.
That's what I heard. I didn't see that, but my wife and daughter went to see it, and she didn't like it. So
I know your feelings on this movie, and I go back to it also. Big Hero 6 was a fantastic movie, whether you're an adult or a child. I saw the movie, I'm drawing a blank, but it had Rihanna was one of the voices, and Steve Martin was like the overlord alien guy.
It was Home. Home was the name of the movie.
Home, right, and O is the screw-up character. That was okay. I mean, so we see all of these movies, but I think it's been a while since I saw one that I was really impressed by.
Yeah, the only one we saw this summer that was good-ish was Finding Dory, and it's hard to screw that up. It wasn't great.
We saw that too. All right. But the fact that I forgot it.
Yeah, that's the thing.
But still, that was really good. And in fact, I mentioned it in my Arnett Mo story. It was kind of a weird angle in there. Is that I was asking his ex-wife the different things about what did he like to eat, and just the basic stuff that make a human. And I asked her what kind of music did he listen to, and she said his favorite song is "What a Wonderful World," and she hears it all the time because it's in commercials and movies. And she said, and in fact, I just took the kids to a movie over the weekend, and it was playing in there, and it made me think of Bjorn. And I said, what was the movie? She said, Finding Dory. And I said, so it's a movie about a fish that has memory issues and can't find its way home. And she said, "Oh my God, I didn't even think of that." And that's when she said, and she starts laughing, that Desperado, for some reason, was the first song that the band played at our wedding reception for us to dance to.
Okay.
And of course, Desperado, the lyrics, and that became a part of my story. And after I wrote the story, members of the band reached out to me on Twitter and to say that was us. And we were just having this conversation a month or so ago about how stupid we were as kids, a young band, that we played these songs that we thought sounded good but didn't pay any attention to the lyrics. So, anyways, that's my tangent on to go from Big Hero 6 to Desperado.
Desperado. That's an impressive jump. Well, Tim Graham, this was great. Thank you for taking the time to join me today.
Anytime, Brian. I always enjoy it.